We've talked about the nature and extent of crime, and we've talked about crime trends. And for this unit, we're going to talk about the demography of crime. So if someone were to say to me, an index offense has been committed, say something about the perpetrator, and I knew nothing about the crime and I knew nothing about the individual perpetrator, if I had to guess something about the perpetrator, I would say that the perpetrator is male. Gender is the best predictor variable for whether or not someone will commit a crime. Based on the UCR, males are arrested at a rate of about 3.5 to 1. And the more serious the crime, the more overrepresented men are. For violent crimes, men are arrested at a rate of 5 to 1 over women. And for murder, they're arrested at a rate of 8 to 1 over women. If you look at the National Crime Victimization Survey, it agrees with the UCR and states that about 80% of violent crime was perpetrated by males. So men are definitely much more involved in committing index offenses than are women. And as you can see, this is reflected in incarceration rates. This graph is from 2010, but it hasn't changed a lot in the ensuing 8 years. And you can see the large majority of incarcerated prisoners in the United States are men. And typically you don't get a prison sentence, actually go to prison, unless you've committed a serious felony or unless you have multiple arrests. So as you can see, all data demonstrate that men are more heavily involved in crime. So why is this the case? Why is it that women commit so little crime relative to men? If you think about it, it's kind of puzzling. For example, some of the things that we believe are correlated with crime would also lead us to believe that women would commit their share of crime. For example, it is widely believed that poverty is closely associated with crime. And we know that female-headed households are the poorest households in America. There are lots of women in poverty, but they don't seem to commit crime at their share or by their proportion population. So what kinds of ideas have criminologists and sociologists put forward to explain this? Well, there are three main hypotheses that we're going to go over. And the first one is something that's called the chivalry hypothesis. And the chivalry hypothesis comes from the work of a guy named Otto Pollock. And Pollock is one of these 19th century writers. And, some of the things that these old 19th century writers thought about were pretty weird. And when you hear their theories, you're like, that's strange. But what has generally happened is these 9th century writers make their points. And even though some of the things they say sound dated or nuts, there's generally a kernel in there that you can latch onto, and subsequent criminologists have sort of latched on to their ideas and developed them. So Otto Pollock's version of the chivalry hypothesis goes something like this. He says that the statistics don't reflect the reality, that in point of fact, women are just as criminal as men are, and women commit just as much crime as men do, but women are more devious. They're just less likely to get caught. So, a man will shoot you or stab you, but a woman will poison your drink because they're crafty. And what was his evidence? That women are innately more crafty and deceitful? Well, this probably says more about his relationship to Mrs. Pollock than it does the nature of men versus women. But Pollock said that because women can fake orgasm, that they are natural liars and natural deceivers. Now, that's a pretty weird idea, and no one would give a lot of weight to that today, but it does raise the question, is there something about the way maybe the criminal justice system or the police approach women? Is there something about the nature of gendered relations that make it less likely for women either to commit crime or to get caught for the crimes that they commit? So, for example, a question I often ask students is, do you believe that a woman can flirt or cry and get out of a speeding ticket? And I would say that substantial proportions of students in my classes will say, yeah, I think that's possible. Sometimes I'll have students say, yes, that happened to me. Are women who are caught less likely to be formally dealt with? In other words, if you think about this as a chivalry hypothesis, is there some sort of bias in the criminal justice system or bias in society that either overlooks or minimizes the crimes that women commit? Well, actually, there is some evidence that suggests, yes, this is so. In lots of studies, we find that at every stage of the criminal justice system, women get lighter treatment than their male counterparts. Women that are charged with crimes are less likely to be convicted. If they're convicted, they're more likely to get shorter sentences. And this gap has persisted for a very long time. So at least with respect to the criminal justice system, women get more lenient treatment than men. So that's an interesting twist on sexism and patriarchy in the United States, because here the patriarchy actually works in women's favor. Just like, you think about the Titanic sinking or a boat sinking, they put women and children in the lifeboat first. So the sort of patronizing belief that women are weaker in society actually saves their lives when a ship sinks. And it's the same kind of thing here. The idea is that women are delicate and weaker by nature, and that there's something aberrant about a woman that commits crime, and so she gets lighter treatment. So that's sort of an unusual twist on patriarchy. The feminist Christina Hoff Sommers has some interesting things to say on this, and I want to play a video clip of Sommers, who is a feminist philosopher, next.
If you are a criminal defendant, it is better to be a woman than a man. For the same crime and with a similar criminal history, men in the United States are imprisoned much more frequently and for much longer sentences. And this is one gender gap that we hear very little about. Coming up next on The Factual Feminist. Now, we incarcerate people in the United States on a scale unheard of in most parts of the world. If you brought together all of those who are now in prison, on probation and on parole, it would constitute like the second largest city in the nation, and it would be close to 90% male. Now, the fact that more men than women go to jail, that in itself is not a sign of discrimination. Men are far more likely to be rule breakers, risk takers, and perpetrators of crime. This is true cross-culturally. But what happens when men and women are arrested for the same crime? Well, to answer that question, Professor Sonia Starr at the University of Michigan Law School, she examined a huge database of federal criminal cases. Now, unlike other studies that looked only at the sentencing stage, she followed the fate of defendants from arrest through sentencing. And her findings are shocking. I mean, after controlling for the arrest offense and criminal history and other relevant factors, and looking at the process from beginning to end, she found that women are significantly more likely than men to avoid charges, to avoid convictions completely. And they're twice as likely to avoid incarceration if convicted. Now, on average, men receive about 63% longer sentences than women arrested for the same crime. Now, Professor Starr estimates that the gender gap in sentencing is about 6 times as large as the sentencing gap between black and white defendants. Now, Starr offers a few possible explanations for the gender disparity. And women are often viewed as followers, accessories of their male romantic partners, so judges and prosecutors might perceive them to be less responsible. Secondly, women are more likely to be the primary caretakers of their children, so prosecutors and judges might worry about the effect of jailing mothers. It's also possible that prosecutors and judges are just more easily persuaded that women who commit crimes have some kind of mental condition, mental problem. Well, what is the solution? Harsher sentences for women? No, that is not the way to go. The U.S. is already known as incarceration nation. We don't want more prisoners. That's not the answer. But if the courts are indeed making exceptions for women for their special circumstances, they should consider doing the same for men. And as Professor Starr points out, about 1 in every 50 American men is currently behind bars, and we could think about gender disparity as perhaps being a key dimension of that problem.
What Christina Hoff Sommers is talking about is exemplified in the case of female sex offenders. Some of you may remember, although many of you would have been small, the case of Deborah Lefebvre. And Deborah Lefebvre was a middle school teacher who had a protracted sexual affair with a 14-year-old student. And when she was arrested and prosecuted, she was given house arrest, a 3-year house arrest. She didn't do any prison time at all. And at the time, there was a lot of outcry about, why such a light sentence? And the idea was that she was too pretty for prison. I mean, it was literally stated that she was an attractive young woman and things would not go well for her in prison. So for her own safety, she should be confined to house arrest instead. And people at the time pointed to the double standard, saying, would a man have been too handsome for prison? Would we worry about how he would fare in prison, being a good-looking guy? And in general, I think the society looked at the crime differently. At the time when Lefebvre was arrested, you had all kinds of comments from people on news stories online, or comments in the culture of men saying things like, oh, I wish I would have had a teacher that initiated me like that when I was 14, or if I was 14 and that was my teacher, I wouldn't have felt like I had been molested. And that's certainly not the kind of thing that you would say if the genders were reversed. So from the perspective of people who advance the chivalry hypothesis, female sex offenders are a classic example of differential treatment by the criminal justice system that in this instance favors women. Another view about the relationship between gender and crime is advanced by the feminist criminologist Frida Adler. And Adler was a professor at Rutgers University when I was a student at Rutgers. And Adler's theory is published in the book Sisters in Crime, which is considered a classic in criminology and was published in the 1960s. And Adler has an interesting idea, and she argues that the reason why women commit less crime than men is because of patriarchy and the oppression of women, and that as women gain equality relative to men, their patterns of crime should begin to look like men's patterns of crime. Now, that's an odd idea. The idea that women are refrain from committing crime because they lack opportunities to commit crime because the patriarchy oppresses them. But here's the general idea. So the idea, for instance, is that maybe parents let boys stay out later than girls. Maybe parents supervise girls more than they supervise their sons. When I was a kid, my parents had a particular curfew for me. My dad used to always say to me, I want you home by midnight because nothing good happens after midnight. And boy, was he right about that. I wonder if he would have been stricter with me if I was his daughter. And I wonder if it's generally true that daughters are more strictly supervised than boys. And if they are more strictly supervised, that would mean they have less opportunity to commit crimes. They couldn't do the things that boys and their friends do late at night when they're out running around. In addition, maybe we sort of look the other way at things that boys do. That when boys engage in antisocial behavior, it's just mischief. When boys engage in vandalism, that's just, rowdy boys. That when boys fight, well, boys will be boys. And that when girls are engaged in those kinds of things, the alarm bells go off at sooner and with less serious behavior. And so the system or parents or families will intervene with girls' antisocial activity at levels that are much less serious than with boys. And this is the essence of the liberation hypothesis. We reward aggression and assertiveness in boys. We suppress it in girls. And so Adler in the 60s is saying, and remember this is in the flowering of the feminist movement, Adler is saying that as women gain equality relative to men, you'll begin to see women's patterns of delinquency and criminality resemble men's. And that's kind of bold in the 1960s because she's essentially making a prediction. Okay, so now, almost half a century later, how has Adler's prediction fared? Adler was predicting there would be something that she called the new female criminal, who would resemble her male counterpart in every way as she gained equality with her male counterpart. And so has this happened? Have male and female crime rates converged since the 1960s? If they have, then Adler was probably right. If they haven't, then we probably need to rethink Adler's theory. Well, here is a graph that shows arrests, rate of arrest for men versus women, the blue line being men, the red line being women. Do you see anything that looks like convergence there? One of the things that you might see if you start looking at 1994, 1995 is that there is a little bit of convergence, but what looks like convergence is actually a decline in men's crime. And to the extent that we see convergence, not just in these arrest rates, but in UCR crime rates, in crime rates as measured by the NCVS, it is the case that men and women's share has narrowed a little bit. But that's because men's criminal activity, rates of men's criminal activity have been dropping faster than women's rates of criminal activity. And part of the reason why that's so is because there's more room for those rates to drop because men are so much more involved in crime that, even a slight percentage of decline in men's crime is a large decline in the absolute numbers of crimes. And so what we see as convergence is really just that. And this is problematic for the liberation hypothesis. Also, even if there has been convergence, the rate of convergence has not kept pace with women's gains in equality relative to men. I mean, even looking at the modest rate of convergence that we see in official statistics, I mean, it would take centuries. Even if these were linear trends, it would take centuries for women's crime rates to match up with men's. And, of course, women have made substantial strides towards equality with men since the 60s. And so most people would say that this aspect, this prediction made by Frida Adler and the liberation hypothesis, doesn't seem to have borne out. We also have some studies that cast doubt on whether boys and girls are actually treated differently these days in society. This is results of a meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis is a sort of a study of studies. People put all of the studies together on this and then look at the aggregate results. And here, what they find are very few differences in parental control of girls and boys. They did find that in the past, girls were more strictly supervised and the boys had more freedom, but that as we have moved forward in time, girls and boys tend to be treated the same. Curfews tend to be the same. Levels of supervision tend to be pretty much the same, and that what might appear to be gender differences are really more attributable to things like birth order. So this has really cast doubt on the liberation hypothesis. The predictions that Adler has made in the 60s have fared very poorly over time. So in addition to the chivalry hypothesis and the liberation hypothesis, there's one other theory, and it's called the masculinity hypothesis. And the roots of this idea trace their provenance to an important criminologist named Cesare Lombroso, who was an Italian physician, and he's one of the founders of the discipline of criminology. And Lombroso worked at a prison in Italy, and it had a women's wing. And so while he was dissecting cadavers of women who had died in the women's prison, he noticed that they were stockier than the average woman in his estimation, that they were bigger boned, that they had more square jaws and heavier brow ridges and more muscles. And he essentially hit upon the idea that these women prisoners were more man-like, that they had more male traits, and that the reason why they committed crime is because they were more man-like, and that in their development they were more leaning towards male characteristics than women characteristics. So because they were more man-like as women, they were more inclined to male activities like crime. And this is the root of the masculinity hypothesis. Now, nobody buys this today. Cesare Lombroso didn't have any kind of control group. He wasn't making comparisons about the traits of female prisoners versus the traits that you find in society at large. And as we will discuss Lombroso later, you'll see he had lots of other ideas that have been discredited and that are politically difficult for sociologists today. But the idea here is that maybe there's something essentially different about women. Maybe women are naturally less disposed to risk-taking and violence, and that what explains gender differences in committing crime is really sort of human nature, the different nature of men and women. Now, right off the bat, I can tell you that sociologists hate explanations like this. Sociologists call this essentialism, or the belief that there are essential and not socially constructed differences between men and women. But these essentialist explanations are very common and very accepted among cognitive neuroscientists, among lots of evolutionary psychologists. And so I want to go over this theory, and this is a theory that is well accepted outside of sociological criminology, and it's a theory that looks at the different natures of men and women to explain the disparity in crime. So one of the things that cognitive neuroscientists and biopsychologists look at are different levels of testosterone in men and women. Testosterone is a hormone. Both men and women have it, but men have it in much higher levels. As you can see from the graph here, this is the level of testosterone in the saliva. The red are the men and the blue are the women, and you can see that almost all men have higher testosterone levels than almost all women. Now, in the animal kingdom, testosterone is linked to aggression in almost all animal species. We see it in mammals, we see it in birds, and testosterone as a hormone is linked to aggressive behavior. And there are many studies that suggest that that testosterone is also linked to aggression in humans. One of the things that we see is that even within men, we'll talk about this when we get to biology and crime, even within men, high testosterone men are more likely to have been arrested or been convicted than low testosterone men. So the idea is that if testosterone is linked to aggression, and if men have higher levels of testosterone, then it stands to reason that men are more predisposed to crime or are more at risk of committing crime. Now, there are some problems with this. Obviously, aggression is not necessarily criminal. There are all kinds of ways for people to be legitimately aggressive in society. Football and boxing and, organized sports are great ways for, even if it's true that men are innately more aggressive, these organized sports are great ways to express your aggression in non-criminal ways. And that's part of the reason why sociologists tend to not like these kinds of explanations. But, the correlation is definitely there. Men commit the crime, men have the testosterone. That correlation is pretty much incontrovertible. And aggression is linked to, testosterone is linked to aggression and violence in the animal kingdom. And you might not like to think of yourself as an animal, but you are an animal. You're a mammal, you're a primate, you're an ape. And so most evolutionary psychologists are pretty comfortable saying that testosterone is a contributor. So whether or not you believe this will depend on your answer to this question. So I want you to imagine, for example, a world without men. Imagine that there are no men. You could probably accomplish this with the technology that we have today. In human cloning, you would need an egg, but you wouldn't necessarily need a sperm. You just need like a strand of RNA, and you could create clones. And so you could have a society with all women. There are some species of lizard and other animals that have parthenogenesis, where every member of the species is female. And I want you to imagine a world full of women. I want you to imagine the president and the cabinet and the entire Congress, House, and Senate, all women. Do you think that nations would still drop bombs on each other and fight wars and shoot each other? Do you think all of that would still happen? Do you think that the conflicts that we see around the world would be the same? Look at all the macho posturing and brinksmanship that we see in Congress. Do you think all that would be the same if it was nothing but women? Or do you think it would be easier for Congress to compromise and find common ground? So the answer to that question depends on the extent to which you believe that men are more innately aggressive, or men are more naturally predisposed to antisocial behavior, which is linked to crime. And, it's just a thought experiment, and no one knows what a future of all women would be like. But this is the kind of thinking that characterizes the masculinity hypothesis, which is probably the leading theory among cognitive neuroscientists and biopsychologists. This chart here looks at grip strength, how strong you are, and with respect to your grip, which is a proxy for strength generally. Along the x-axis, you can see age in years, and on the vertical axis is this measure of strength. The green dots are women, and the blue dots are males. And one of the things that you see is, just as almost all men have higher testosterone levels than almost all women, almost all men are stronger than almost all women. And some people have argued, even without testosterone, this would implicate men in index crimes. So, for example, one way to accomplish a robbery is to physically intimidate the person that you are robbing. And so to the extent that the average man is bigger than the average woman, it is, all things being equal, easier for a man to accomplish a robbery, especially without a gun. If you want to rob somebody with a knife, or you just want to rob somebody by threatening to beat them up, it stands to reason that the opportunities to do that are better if you're 6'3" than if you're 5'3". And there are a heck of a lot more 6'3" men than there are 6'3" women. So all things being equal, just being bigger and stronger makes robbery something that you feel like you might be able to accomplish versus something that you are thinking you're unlikely to accomplish. By the same token, if I'm going to be a burglar, or I'm going to steal something, one of the things that might enter my mind as I'm calculating whether or not I'm going to do it is how fast I can run. If someone chases me, if I get caught, how fast can I clear that fence? How fast can I make it, to those trees, or to that through that field, to my getaway? And the simple fact is that the average man runs faster than the average woman. So just thinking about your prediction about whether or not you'll be able to outrun the cops or outrun someone that comes after you, that determines whether or not you'll commit a burglary. And because the average man is faster than the average woman, all things being equal, men are more likely to say, yeah, that crime is going to be worth it, or that's something that I can pull off. And so that is part of the reason why men have higher crime rates than women, according to this view. Physical anthropologists look at violence and antisocial behavior among chimpanzees. Sociologists aren't super keen on comparing human behavior with chimp behavior, but this is something physical anthropologists and biopsychologists do all the time. And they look at murder and violence in chimpanzee troops, and what they find is that male chimpanzees engage in violence at the same rates relative to women, female chimpanzees, as humans do. And what would explain that? It must be something essential to their nature: testosterone, morphology, whatever. So humans and chimpanzees share about 98% the same DNA. Not only are they our closest genetic relative, we're theirs. And so it would stand to reason, according to these thinkers, that what explains gender differentials in violence in a chimpanzee group is relevant to what explains violence in human groups, particularly because the exact same percentages prevail. Finally, these scholars look at the physical properties of brains, and they make the argument that because male and female brains are different, male and female thoughts must be different. And since crime originates in the mind, that difference in thinking is reflected in criminal behavior. So this article here points out that if you, this computer algorithm can look at brain scans and sort these brains into male and female brains with something like 94% accuracy. If you took 100 brains out of 50 men and 50 women and assembled them on a table in random order and had forensic pathologists come in and divide them up into which brains belong to men and which brains belong to women, they could do it with a level of accuracy that far exceeds chance. So if there are essential differences in the structure of brains, and if brains are involved in thinking, how can there not be essential differences in the nature of male versus female thought? That's the logic that undergirds the masculinity hypothesis. Sociologists don't like these explanations, but other criminologists prefer them. So those are three views for the differences between men and women with respect to crime: the chivalry hypothesis, the liberation hypothesis, and the masculinity hypothesis.